My name is Lazarus. Lazarus of Bethany. But maybe you know my sisters better, Martha and Mary. Two of them are always having people over, never happier than when the house is full, especially with those who've come to Jerusalem for one of the festivals. Bethany, you see, the village that we live in, is just over the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. You might call it the suburbs. Just a couple of kilometers to the city, easy access to the temple of the Almighty. That's why Jesus and his disciples were so often our guests. Our home became their home. And eventually, our hearts became his as well. There was just something about him. Like when Jesus was here, he brought the glory and the holiness of the temple with him. And he loved us. As your Jim Buttress would say, the feeling was mucilage. Jesus loved us. And that's not to say that we were special in any way. Jesus loved us, but he loved us with that kind of love that can so easily extend to many and yet remain distinctly personal. If you're the parent of multiple kids, you'll know what I mean. To have Jesus in our home was a gift. He was our teacher, our hope, the one who was coming into the world, but he was also our friend. And when he was away from Jerusalem, back in Galilee or across the Jordan, we missed him. And we wondered how he was, what threats he was facing, what deeds he was performing, what lives were being touched. And it was during one of those times when Jesus was elsewhere, after the Feast of Dedication, the one that you might know as Hanukkah, that I first began to notice it. You know how these things begin. Aches and pains that at first you put down to, if not the years, then at least the mileage. Then a fatigue that you're sure is just the result of the schedule that you've been keeping. But no matter what you do, you just can't shake it. It persists. And it gets worse and worse. And eventually, you're forced to admit that something is wrong. Seriously wrong. That's where I was that winter. It's not that we were unfamiliar with disease. Illness of all sorts was common in the crowded streets of Jerusalem, especially in the winter, especially among the poor. In the first century, illness and death were companions you just learned to live with. But in Bethany, well, it's not like we felt like we were immune. It's just that you never think about it happening to you until it does. At first, as you've probably guessed, there was denial. It's just a bug. I'll shake this thing in no time. But once it became clear that this was something more. As things seemed to get worse by the day, I didn't know what to do. How could this be happening to me? Why wasn't I able to deal with this? It was like my own body was letting me down. I began to pray. My sisters too. But things just continued to get worse. Soon I could barely get out of bed. Weak as a baby. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It was like my body was wasting away. Why wasn't the Almighty listening to our prayers, I wondered? I promised a donation to the temple. I pleaded that I'd support Jesus' ministry for a year. He could fix this, I thought. How many others had Jesus healed? My sister said the same thing. If only Jesus was here. From my bed, I wondered where he was. Then, through the haze, I remembered Jesus had left Judea. The last time he'd been in Jerusalem, the authorities had tried to stone him. It'd simply be too dangerous for him to be here. For Jesus to come back to Bethany now would be like walking back into the lion's den. For him to come here now might mean life for me, but it would be death for him. I was on my own. I wept. Martha and Mary wept as well. Days went by. I was sinking into the pit. Words of Psalm 88 came to me. My life draws near to Sheol. Moments of lucidity soon became just flashes, a face, a voice. One of my sisters saying they were trying to get a message to Jesus. That would be nice, I thought. Just to see him one more time. After that, I don't remember very much. Everything now was gray, like seeing the world through a fog. Though I could still occasionally hear Mary or Martha saying my name. And then it was black. And then there was silence. The next thing that I remember clearly, and the next thing that I can talk to you about confidently, was a voice. A voice that spoke my name. Lazarus, it said. Lazarus, come out. I struggled to get up. It was like I'd gotten tangled in the blankets. I thrashed about for a few seconds until I could get my feet on the ground, and then I began to walk toward that voice. A voice I knew, a voice I loved. A voice that spoke with all of the authority in the universe. There was no resisting that voice. And there was simply no reason to try to resist. Contained within that voice was everything that I have ever wanted. That voice was hope and health and home. That voice was shalom incarnate. And as I followed it, I emerged into the light. Unbind him and let him go, the voice said. And suddenly there were hands, tender hands, trembling hands, helping me. Something was removed from my eyes, and I could see. I could see the day. I could see all the faces. And I could see one face in particular, the face of Jesus. You came for me, was all that I could think. You came for me. And it was like he could hear. And then I saw where I was. And I realized where I'd come from, what the blankets had been, why there'd been a cloth over my eyes. My tomb was behind me. And I realized the enormity of what he had done. The gates he had shattered. The depths into which his voice had reached. The lengths to which he'd been willing to go. The power that was embodied in that command, come out. And I knew that I was standing in the presence of the one whose authority none could deny. The presence of the one who is resurrection. The presence of the one who is life itself. Later on, Martha and Mary shared with me some of what had happened. How as the days went by, I'd continued to slip away, how they'd sent word to Jesus and hoped and prayed and waited, and how their hoping and praying and waiting had seemed to be in vain. They told me about all those who'd come when I died. The friends, the people of influence from Jerusalem, leading Pharisees, members of the Sanhedrin. They told me about the funeral. By the way, there aren't very many people who get to hear about their own funeral. As far as I know, just a handful in the history of the world. But having had that experience, let me tell you that it's probably not a bad idea to think about your own funeral from time to time. What you'd want people to say. What that means for who you are and what you do today. They told me about how Jesus had come and about how he'd challenged them not to give up hope, even though I'd been in the tomb for 4 days, and about how he'd wept on the way to the tomb. You might think it was those tears that told me how much Jesus loved me. But it wasn't. Whoever those tears were for, they weren't for me. Jesus knew where I was. Jesus knew what he'd come to do. No, the thing that showed me how much Jesus loved me was that he was there. That he'd come back to Judea. That he had come back into the lion's den. That he was willing to put his own life on the line in order to give life back to me. His disciples had been sure that he was heading to his death. And as it proved just a few weeks later, when he came back to Jerusalem for Passover, he was. Back into the lion's den, he came once again. There are two things that all of this proved to me. Two thoughts I want to leave you with this morning. The first is simply this: there is no situation so desolate that the arrival of Jesus can't inject it with new hope. There is no distance so great that Jesus' voice cannot bridge the gulf. There is no end so final that Jesus cannot provide a new beginning. There is no pit so deep that Jesus cannot reach in and pull you out. And that even includes the grave. That's something we should have remembered just a few weeks later when Jesus' own body was laid in a tomb and sealed behind a stone. I hope that whatever pit you may be facing, having seen the tomb emptied, that's something that you can remember today. Jesus' reach is so much longer than we can imagine. The second thing I want you to know is related to all of that. And that's that there is no length to which Jesus will not go to offer you life. In fact, what he showed me when he came in spite of the danger is that if it comes down to a choice between your life and his life, he will choose your life every time. And that too was something that he demonstrated that Passover after I died and lived. That weekend he was willing to put himself into that place where it would be his life that was offered instead of ours. He would take upon himself the wages of our sin, and he would offer in our place the kind of sacrifice that we could never make. He would become our substitute. And in doing that, the life that he is, and the life to which he was entitled, became ours. Never forget, Jesus chose you over himself, just as he did for me. In fact, even his choosing me was for you. Did you know that? That's something else that I learned later, not from Mary and Martha, but from the others, those who came with him. This is what he said: for your sake, I am glad that I was not there. Why on earth would Jesus be glad that he wasn't there. Because if he was there, I would not have died. And if I hadn't died, I wouldn't have been raised. And that wasn't just for me. It wasn't just for Martha and Mary. It was for you. So that you may believe. I hope you do. I hope you do believe that there is no pit so deep that Jesus can't reach in and pull you out. And I hope you do believe that there is no length to which Jesus will not go to offer you life. And that when it does come down to a choice between your life and his, he'll choose your life every time. The life he has for you. The life he'll share with you. The life that he's made possible for you. A life that even the grave can't contain. Of that, I am living proof.